Hey y'all, welcome to Noetic. I'm CJ, this is Jordan,
hey,
and we are going to be discussing Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. We are on book 6 right now, and Jordan is going to lead the discussion here. And let's get started. Where would you like to begin, Jordan?
So I think we should start where we left off with last podcast, when you killed it as the seminar leader. Shucks. And there were, I think, a few lingering questions that we had sort of about like the metaphysics and, you know, the nature of the divine. So a couple questions that we had left over were, what is the divine? Is Zeus separable from the universe? Is Zeus just mind? Or does Zeus have any other traits other than just being some sort of like disembodied sort of floating form of intelligence? And then a couple of concepts that we explored is the tension between human insignificance and sort of the grand scheme of sort of a fatalistic plan in the universe. And then we touched a little bit on the like an emerging schematization of the universe, which was non-living beings being inferior to living beings, rational life being superior to non-rational beings. And then we sort of posed the question that is maybe the universe is more superior to an individual human life. So those are a few things that we touched on. And if I recall, in sort of our previous podcasts on the text, we were kind of a little bit confused of how Meditations was put together. So I kind of did a little bit of digging around. So I thought that if we talked about like the sort of central sort of tenets of Stoicism might help us sort of direct us and understand the text better and where Marcus Aurelius is coming from.
That's a good point, because a lot of this is random in the sense that we're not getting an argument. Maybe we are getting an argument throughout this work, but we have to piece it ourselves. Marcus Aurelius doesn't give us a step-by-step logical format. It's these little ramblings or little scribbles that he's able to write, and each book is kind of comprised of these writings at a certain period.
Yeah, so I think that it seems like through the research that I've done is that I think that it was our original impression that, he was just kind of scrawling these down sort of haphazardly. But I want to give credit to John Sellers, who is a professor at the University of West England, and he wrote a really lovely entry on Marcus Aurelius and Meditations via the internet of Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
So what does he say? What is it? How is it, actually?
So we know that Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. That's pretty much just fact. And at this point in time, Epictetus was probably the most renowned Stoic of his time. And according to Epictetus, that there should have, if you're sort of an apprentice philosopher, you should pretty much understand these sort of three central ideas, or sort of topoi, in philosophical discourse. So it's discourse pertaining to the physical, so the universe, discourse pertaining to the ethical, and then discourse pertaining to the logical. So early Stoicism really only applied these three concepts to just conversation and discourse. But what's cool about Epictetus is that he takes it one step further, and he says that it's not enough just to talk about it. He wanted to apply it to action. So even though we don't necessarily have a sort of a structured work where he explicitly states, these are my arguments, and here's a logical step-by-step guide of how to work your way through my arguments, these are the topoi that he deals with. So I thought that might be helpful in helping us understand a little bit better.
That gives a great foundation, just because you do have these little parts where he talks about the whole, and then all of a sudden he talks about how to deal with other people that might not be as nice as everyone else, and you wonder how that all fits together. But if there is this sort of schematization that Epictetus sort of sets up, and if Marcus Aurelius is a follower or an admirer of Epictetus, then maybe we can see that he directed himself towards those things to think about, like you said. And that helps out a lot. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Right, so it might not be explicitly sketched in each book, but if we think of things arranged in a sort of a topical manner, that might help us navigate the text better for ourselves and for our listeners.
For sure, and I think we have to emphasize again and again that these are journalistic entries, or these are journals, essentially, and that we're not dealing with a work that was meant for publication either. So in a sense, it's almost just like, what can I complain about? It's not like he set this up to be published, so the order in which these ideas come about is completely natural to whatever maybe he was going through at the time or wherever his headspace was. So it's almost as if somebody complains about the quality of a video that's free. You know, you're like, well, let me give you your money back. There's nothing to worry about. So it's, it's like, oh, well, the arguments aren't really laid out. And it's just like, well, I'm sorry. Let me talk to the publisher and see if we can get,
right,
it all fixed out so Marcus can write it differently. So,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's fascinating work in that regard, or it's very non-linear in that regard. But I think doing what we're doing now, especially as we go from book to book, we have to lay out certain anchors, at least to keep us in place amidst this rolling tide. So I think it's wonderful that you at least gave us these 3 anchors. And what were they again? They were the metaphysical, or at least like the worldly,
right,
and then ethical, and then
the logical. Yep.
Wonderful. Would you like to begin with one of those, or do you want
sure.
to?
And I think that the thing that really intrigued me, I'd say the most, is the physical world. And so for the physical world, for a lot of Stoics, it's very complex, it's interconnected, and it's tied to God. And the individual, may or may not be, maybe sort of like a little bit of a speck, but the emphasis is that the human being is one part of a greater system. And what I thought was really interesting is the fact that the Stoics believe that your ethical actions and your logical reasoning should follow your understanding of the physical world.
So if you understood the world better, you were able to be a better person, I suppose.
Yeah, so if the reasoning is that you, if you understand that you are a part of something greater than just yourself, then that probably means, I don't know, I was just thinking, okay, like maybe like with like littering, if you view yourself to be a part of a greater sort of ecosystem, so to speak, then you aren't going to be as willing, or or lazy when it comes to picking up after yourself. Instead of like throwing that bottle out of your car, maybe you would just wait to recycle it instead.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, I think it was chapter 44, where at the end he talks about how, or at least in my translation, is my city and country is Rome, and as a human being, it is the world. So what benefits these 2 cities is my only good. And then later on he talks about how, I think like a beehive. This is a great little analogy where he says, I think it's chapter 54, where he says, what does not benefit the hive does not benefit the bee either. So in the sense that if we know what is good for the world, and in a sense it's just the cycle of life, everything is just in some sense, that if that's all good for the world, then I have to correspond to that in some way. And
yeah, and I think that the more you resist that, and the more you find yourself out of tune, so to speak, with the universe, the more frustrating it is going to be. Like your life is just going to be much more frustrating because you have so many forces acting against you.
So what do you mean by that? As in, it's just everybody's an enemy in some regard, or everybody's out to get you?
Yeah, and he even says that too, when he pretty much says that, you just basically have a choice to kind of just go with the flow. Or, let's see. Oh, okay, so chapter 41, he says that when you view yourself as disconnected, then you start to view people, you start to either blame the gods for your problems, or you become hateful or suspicious of others. So does that help clarify?
No, that makes sense. And I think it goes to this idea in the beginning that you mentioned, of the idea of even the physical, where if we have that idea and that everything happens for a reason and is just, then we can make it so that anything that happens to us, either external, whether that be a person or an event, whether it be health or anything like that, we can look at it as part of that greater whole and see that, okay, well, it takes certain bad things, not even bad, but it just takes, things happen and they become different things, or for something to transform, it's got to go through this. And if I can be okay with that and accept that, then my life can be better, more in tune, like you said.
Right. And I thought one thing that really struck me as fascinating, as Sellers points out, is that nature is obviously very complex, or nature of the universe, whatever you'd like to call it. And what we perceive is not just a physical material alone. And it's actually really a composite of the physical material and the object that we sense with our own sort of involuntary judgment. And then it's interesting because it's not just what factors into your involuntary judgment is really your own habits, it's your own practices, and the preconceptions that you have that influence your judgment on material objects that you sense.
So is that almost in the sense, like, if you make something to be good or bad, then that affects you in some way, or that clouds your judgment of just accepting things as they are.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So it's really interesting. So by extension, then, if we sort of extrapolate further, if you keep a close eye on your behavior and your sort of ethical sphere of being, so to speak, and if you are really conscientious about the habits that you develop, it actually affects how you see the physical world.
Yeah, and that's something, even to go back to chapter 41. He does say that, like, okay, there's the external, there's not good or bad, there just is. He goes back and says, well, actually, and I'll quote him, if we determine that only what lies in our own power is good and evil, there is no reason left us either to charge a god or to take a hostile stance to a man. So I'm supposing he means in the sense that if we can determine what we do as either for the whole or against the whole, then that is how we judge we don't judge the world, we judge our own judgments, I suppose, and whether they are in line with accepting the world as it is or not. Right.
And here's an example which I thought was interesting that Sellers proposes, is when say it's like the weekend and you're, out strolling about at a park, whatever, and you happen to see some people picnicking and drinking like several bottles of wine. And your first instinct isn't necessarily to say they're drinking a large amount of wine, which would be something objective, like you would perceive 10 bottles of wine and maybe 2 people. You wouldn't necessarily do the math first. People tend to have that knee-jerk reaction of, wow, they're drinking too much wine.
They already put a limit.
So versus the actual numerical number of, say, 10 bottles versus your own value judgment of they're drinking too much wine.
So we already, in a sense, put, that's, so too much wine would be, okay, well, you can't have that much. We don't just say, that's a lot you're drinking there. But we frame it in a way that we perceive that as bad.
Right.
Or maybe even good, like, hell yeah, I'm going to have some too. Let's get wasted. We perceive it either way, which
either
it takes.
Exactly. So instead of objectively saying the number of bottles, you would say, wow, that's too much, or wow, that's not enough.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that goes to even littler points he makes. I think it's in chapter 26 and 27. I sort of call it his no bitch policy sort of thing, where he's just kind of like, he outlines, at least in 26, he outlines, chapter 26, this instance where he is spelling a name for somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he says, well, how am I going to do this? Am I going to get angry about it? Am I going to lose my temper about, I'm assuming, maybe the equivalent's like he's spelling cat to, somebody's like, how do you spell cat? And like, the person knows how to spell cat, and you're just kind of like, mother, see, right. Hey, gritting your teeth. But I'll quote him. He says, what then if they get angry? Will you use your temper too? Will you not rather calmly go through the sequence of letters, telling them each one in turn? So also in your life here, remember that every duty is the completed sum of certain actions. You must observe these without being disconcerted or answering others' resentment with your own, but following each purpose methodically to its end. And I think that combines what you're saying about everything having a certain end, or the physical part where everything, if we look at what happens in life or what happens in the world as having a certain end, which might be completing the whole in some way, then we have to look at losing our temper or saying that's too much wine, or how can you not spell cat, right, as being ways of impeding on that grasping of the whole. So I like that example just because it shows a practical sense of what we're discussing, and begs us to be calmer about these things and to realize that even people that cut us off on the road are all still part of the whole, and that we cannot fuss at them because it's all part of it. And that sounds sort of defeatist and sort of thrown out, but I think Marcus Aurelius puts it in a way that's practical, and I don't know, it makes sense in some way.
Yeah, and I think to follow your point with 42 and 43 is that he literally says we are all working together to a single end. And he says that some of us are aware of it, and there are some people who aren't, and they try to resist what takes place in the universe, or they try to criticize it. But the reality is that everyone, no matter how annoying they are, has like their place in the world. And he pretty much says it's up to you whether or not, if you want to become useful, and you can either resist it or submit to it.
Yeah, that's a great part, especially 42. I'm gonna quote where he says, "And there's room even for the critic who tries to oppose or destroy the production. The world had need. Oh, wait, is it? Yeah, production. The world had need for him too. It's just like, oh, we need that guy too. Even the guy that cuts you off at work, or the guy that tries to destroy what you do. And if you look at the world, maybe as a Marcus Aurelius or a Stoic, maybe you would or just as a normal person, you would see there are destructive elements of nature in of itself. So you would conclude in some way that, okay, well, there's destructive elements, there are life-giving elements, and they all work in tandem in some way to create the world that I am seeing right now. So why fuss about it? Yeah,
exactly. And because a lot of that too is just, if you really think about it, and this with the grand scale of things, then perceptions to things like floods or natural disasters or anything like that really in our mind becomes a value judgment.
Yeah, that's too much water. Too much water going in. It's just like, oh, that's just a lot of water that's just coming down the stream and is going to flood my city. Or not flood, it's just going to just be a lot of water.
Yeah, and I think even in the face of those sort of calamities, in 46, he pretty much just says that the scenes are just forever repeated, and the spectacle of life just becomes irksome and just irritating. So it's interesting that he's telling himself that he needs to view life in this sort of way where there's like this ennui or this boredom already, and he just kind of, you know, the sentiment of I'm just ready to check out, you know.
Yeah,
I'm not really bothered. I've seen it all.
Yeah, and that's something he has to remind himself again and again and again, is that these things have happened, and we're going to see that in the next book. But he even says that here too. I can't remember which one, but at least what I get is this sense it's like, we've been here before, this hasn't changed. And he actually does say that at the beginning of book 7, so I lied. It's not in book 6.
Oh, okay.
But he's preparing himself in some way of just saying this all of it, even the negative parts are a part of it. And even in 36, he says that, so even the lion's gaping jaws, poison, every kind of mischief are, like thorns or bogs, consequential products of that which is noble and lovely. So do not think them alien to what you worship, but reflect rather on the fountain of all things. And I think that's the key, to reflect on the fountain of all things, that when we're talking about the whole, we are talking about the people that might backstab you, your enemies,
animals that want to eat you.
Animals that want to eat you, yeah. And we're dealing with all of those things. And maybe that also plays into the physical world, or just understanding the whole, that if you can comprehend that, then in a sense you can be stoic, I suppose, or you can have a positive outlook on what happens to you, whether it be whatever happens to you. I was going to say whether it be positive or negative, but that plays into the value judgment.
Yeah, but there is a little bit of a positive outlook, and I think that sort of to what you said in chapter 38. I'm just going to read it just because I think it's just really a lovely passage.
Sure.
Reflect again and again on how all things in the universe are bound up together and interrelated. For all things, in a sense, are mutually intertwined, and by virtue of all of that are dear to one another. For one thing follows duly upon another because of the tensile movement and the common breath that pervades throughout in the unity of all substance.
Yeah. That plays right into it.
Yeah, so I think that, was it a couple podcasts ago where we were kind of struggling with, does he really take a stance on sort of the Epicureanism, and does he really buy into, the whole crazy cosmic flow of atoms, or does he really believe in a structured universe? And here it's indicative that he very much believes in a structured and ordered universe.
Because anything that seems unstructured is just a part of the whole, I suppose. Is that a...
Yeah, and I think that there's also sort of an important emotional element for him too, of sort of choosing whether or not, if things are just sort of like a random just assortment of matter that's just, just kind of chaos. And I think that has a lot to do with his own worldview. In chapter 10, he's flipping sort of back and forth between the sort of Epicurean view of sort of the what my translation calls the entangling of atoms. And he asks, why should I even wish to linger in such a random assemblage and chaotic disarray? And he says, why should I be concerned about anything other than how one day I shall, quote, turn to the earth? So it's interesting because with the whole Epicurean thing, it's almost like a nihilism, right? Of, if I'm just a big composite of atoms, then just screw it. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to change into some sort of state. Either way, I'm just going to become ether in like a week. So why should I care about how I act now?
So then Marcus Aurelius is putting responsibility on himself by saying that there is some whole, or at least some greater order to things, and that if there is, then he has some kind of obligation to himself to keep that going within himself, I suppose, or acknowledge it.
Yeah, he does, because conversely, he says, on the other hand, but if the other alternative is true, I submit reverently, I stand secure, I place my trust in the power that governs all.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder how it would be if he believed the Epicurean way, if he believed that everything just kind of went crazy. I wonder if he would be the same emperor. Maybe he would have been one of those crazy hedonistic Roman emperors that just ruined everything. And maybe that is something that's very important to realize, that if someone has this purpose, or that the world has some sort of purpose, that perhaps that could direct somebody into direct everything that they do in some degree. Mm-hmm. And maybe that did for Marcus Aurelius. I don't want to emphasize one thought over another for him, but the way you describe it, like you said, it's almost choosing between a nihilism that could lead to debauchery and hedonism, or a directed, purposeful whole that could lead to virtue and stoicism, I suppose. Which, both are interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned hedonism, because on 13 he talks about viewing things as they are.
Yes.
So when you are at a really fancy dinner party, that feast that you're consuming are just corpses of dead animals. The Falernian wine that you're drinking is just grape juice, and the purple robe that you wear is just sheep's wool dipped in the blood of shellfish.
And in my thing, he also talks about sex, where he's just like, and in sexual intercourse, that is no more than the friction of a membrane and a spurt of a mucus ejected. And it goes back to the value judgment, like you said, that we view these things as such positives, and yet Marcus Aurelius is imploring to himself that he needs to just view these things as they are.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, what's the reason why he's telling himself that? It's because, he is human, and that these are things that he's tempted by good food, some good wine, like women, or men, so I mean, so that's the thing that it makes him very human. I thought that 48 was 49 chapter 49 was interesting, because it just shows that these are things that he struggles with, of just temptation. And even 49, he says, he asks, or he chides himself for saying, oh, why are you hung up on your weight? Mm-hmm. So just stuff like that is that you really admire him, because you see him struggle with the mundane things of, oh man, I should not be binging as much during these feasts, like I'm starting to pack on the weight too.
Yeah, but he justifies it in, again, I think we're moving into the ethical.
Yeah, and the ethical degree, and the practical.
Yeah, but he sort of goes back to the physical to justify the ethical, and I'll continue that at least with my translation, where he says, just as you are content with the amount of matter allocated to you, so you should be content with your allocation of time. In this sense, and he refers to earlier about, why resent a lifespan of so many years and not more? Why resent that you have 100 pounds or whatever amount of pounds more than you are? That's just what it is. So we have to be content with what we have. If everything is a part of the whole and everything is given its just time, or it's just whatever, then weight should be the same way too. That as much as maybe they're not weight problems, it's just what it is.
Right. Yes, it's like the function of taking something, just seeing, I think what Marcus Aurelius would say is like looking to the inner nature of things.
Yeah, and trying to understand it in a way better than some people, and realize that maybe other people, I think he looks at people sympathetically in some degree. There is a lot of posturing maybe that we saw in previous books too, where he says, oh, these people that don't know what they're talking about, that try to ruin my life, or it's all implied, but we know he's probably talking about political enemies or perhaps people of that higher status that maybe bore him or he finds rather shallow. But there's this great little part where he says, regardless of all that, we have to love these people. We have to love everyone. But he emphasizes it where he says, but your love, and I think this is chapter 39, but it's just the last part. He says, but your love must be genuine. It has to be real. It can't just be this love that you throw on for the sake of getting by or for Stoics' sake, I suppose. Like, oh, I want to be like Epictetus, so like I'm not going to get mad at that person. Yeah. And there's something to that, and I'm wondering, how Marcus Aurelius would view a genuine love, or what does genuine love mean to him? What does it mean for him to have love be genuine? Is what I've been pondering after reading that, and I'm not really sure. I don't know if you have any idea what it could mean.
I think that it's just really a respect and honoring. I mean, if we think about how he believes that reason governs over sort of the whole universe and all the sort of like malleable material that we have, it's really just honoring your reason, and by extension honoring sort of all that creation that sort of exists under reason.
So it's combining the logical and the physical in some degree, because you are respecting the logical part, or I guess the reason, and then you're respecting that everything is a part of the whole, I suppose, or the physical.
Right.
And once you have those two in some alignment, then you can love your neighbor, regardless if he cuts you off or tries to kill you or whatever. You can love him genuinely.
Right.
In that respect.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I'll try to think about which chapter it is, but he basically urges us or himself to be generous to pretty much all beings, especially those that are non-rational. So he almost has that sense of generosity towards people, and he pretty much says when people are sort of led astray in sort of false belief, that he just so for in chapter 27 he says that there are a lot of people who will chase things that they think are suitable and beneficial to themselves, and if you bar them from that activity, they're going to get really angry. And he says you can't get really mad at their bad behavior though. And if they really push the issue, and if you are genuinely correct, he just says instruct them and show them the truth without becoming annoyed. So there's that same sort of generosity that is expected for rational beings and non-rational beings.
And again, it seems to emphasize not having value judgments, I suppose. You would think.
Yeah, it'd be sort of divorcing yourself from that.
Yeah, because I suppose that goes to what you just read or summarized about how, well, if you get a little angry, that's almost putting a value to it because you assume that something is going to happen, or you assume that this person would understand such and such a thing, but they don't, and that makes you angry, I suppose. Or he understands too little.
Right.
Yeah, instead of just like, okay, he's like this, I have to explain this to him. Yeah. Huh. That's really neat. And I'm glad we're combining all of these different spheres that you talked about.
Because I think that they actually all, if you really sort of tease it all out, they all work together, actually.
Yeah. I'm curious. We haven't really talked about the logical as much, besides that one thing about including reason involved, or acknowledging or respecting the reason of other people.
Yeah, and we totally...
Is there anything else from book 6 that you noted that might revolve around reason?
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing is about reason is that the way that he describes it is that it almost takes on this sort of divine element to it. In chapter 5, he says that reason, it governs all things, and it knows its own disposition and what it creates and what material. So it generates this sort of material, it presides over it, and then it's almost omniscient.
So it's almost as if anything, if we go back to the physical, that anything that happens, the governing reason would know that is a good thing, or it's not that anything happens is not an accident. Yeah,
actually, that's literally exactly it. In chapter 8, he says that it's the ruling center, and it sort of animates itself, it adapts itself, it fashions itself according to its will, and quote, makes whatever happens to it appear to itself as it wishes to be.
So we almost get the physical and the logical combined into one thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. So it's basically how you act should be dictated by the logical and the physical. So it's when you act in a logical or an ethical manner, you're acting in a way that the universe prescribes.
Okay, that the physical world
should dictate how you how you ought to act.
Wow, that's a really intriguing relationship between those three, because they all inform each other in some way. It sounds like just like what you're saying. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I didn't really think of it that way before.
And then taking it sort of one step further, which makes this like even crazier, which is kind of cool, is it's not just nature forms us, but nature is also a part of us in chapter 40. But where things are sort of coordinated by nature, that part that made them lies within them and remains there. And for that reason, you should revere it more and believe that if you live and act according to its will, all will proceed for you according to your mind's desire.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's neat.
So it's cool to see how the ethical, the logical, and the natural sort of all work in tandem with each other in this sort of stoic universe.
And how they can have practical implications too, in a sense where you can direct yourself to be more empathetic towards others and to genuinely love others as we described, and you can be patient. Again, I mean, empathy, I think, is the umbrella virtue, but you can be patient, you can be kind, you can be calm, but in a sense you can have more empathy because you understand the logical and the physical. You understand those things, and that we are all governed by a certain logic or reason, and that everybody possesses it, even if some people don't know or are ignorant to it. And then we have this physical whole where everything happens for a reason, where maybe if you get gypped, it's okay. I mean, it reminds me of that Modest Mouse song, Float On.
Yeah,
where it's just like, it'll all float on.
Right,
it's
exactly.
Just that. It'll all float on in some way. So if we look at that, then it all floats on, and it's all fine.
Yeah, exactly. It's just kind of the sort of the wheel keeps on turning, and it's just, it goes on.
Yeah, and I think it's great you brought up the atoms, the crazy, is it just a stew, or is it purpose driven? Because I think that's at the heart of it as well, where if it was this Epicurean
sort of soupy
atomic
soup.
I mean, I like goulash, so that's fine.
Yeah.
It's just this metaphysical goulash.
Yeah.
Then what would be the use of trying to do good at all in some degree? If, like you said, if it's all just random. But if there is some guiding principle, and if not aligning to it is in some way a detriment, I suppose, to your own physical well-being, then there is some degree that you want to be in tune with it. And maybe that's not a good justification, because you could say even the same way, like, I just want to break shit. Like, there's all this order. I just want to ruin it. But there's something about, I think it's for Marcus Aurelius, that he really gets at. And you quoted, I think, chapter 10, where he says, well, but if it's like this, if it is this ordered life, if the physical and the logical have this purpose, then I should, by God, have a purpose as well, and I should revere the logical and the physical, and have that inform the ethical, and inform my life as an emperor and as a human being.
Right. So that's the thing, is that I think what we sort of tend to forget with a lot of philosophy is we look for these perfect systems. But we kind of tend to forget that, well, at least for the ancients, was the philosophy and how they perceive themselves in the universe is really just a way to inform their own actions.
Yeah, because it does seem rather vague, at least that three-part way of, I guess, philosophy working, I suppose, by Epictetus, in the sense of, okay, well, you just have the logical, the physical, and the ethical. In a way, it seems quite practical, too. I mean, I have to take back what I said. I was going to say that all sounds rather in the clouds, but even that listing of three things, I think, is very practical, too, in some respect. Because it's just like, how do I live? What is the world around me? And what is the thing governing how I perceive those two things or work with those two things?
Absolutely. And
if I can get all of those in line, and maybe not get my ducks in a row, but think about those things and try to understand them, then I too can perhaps have a more fulfilled life.
Yeah. No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think that I just want to touch on one thing, because I totally think that we sort of covered a lot of territory with the metaphysical, which was super fun. One thing that I actually thought, which answered the one question about the nature of gods, which was kind of just driving me kind of crazy throughout this text. And just real quick on chapter 44, and how he talks about how the gods sort of take counsel, and they all kind of almost have like a staff meeting. And he pretty much says that whatever that the gods say that's good for the common good is, sort of good enough for him. And I thought that's so interesting, because throughout the text he talks about sort of reason and Zeus being just this sort of one entity, but just in this one particular instance, he kind of throws a wrench in that idea with the sort of the anthropomorphic, almost Homeric gods, that they're like these people that are all kind of like deliberating and trying to decide what's good for the universe and like what's good for Marcus Aurelius specifically.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a more practical view of it, I suppose. If it maybe goes back to the practicality and the idea of the whole, where anything that happens is part of it, is part of the whole, is the governing reason, and having the pantheon of gods in a staff meeting trying to make up some decision for Marcus Aurelius, and if they say that Marcus Aurelius loses a battle, then Marcus Aurelius can't really complain about it, because that's just part of the whole. That is the governing logic, or the governing reason makes it so that that's the outcome, and he has to not only accept it, but
just
embrace it, and love it in some way. And maybe in installments in the future we can discuss the idea of amor fati a little more, because that is such a fascinating component, and it touches on the question that you asked in the beginning, or one of them, about how do we deal with having this control and then having this universe where we don't really have control, and it's very fate driven. And Marcus Aurelius does mention that a lot in previous books. He's brought up Clotho, or at least one of the sisters of fate, and how we have to accept that, and it's this really confusing sort of thing, and it's really odd to our ears, I suppose, because we think, oh well, everybody has control, free will, all of that. But if you kind of throw that aside with this idea of fate, it's kind of wait, what? Do we have control? Wait, what's going on? So that might be something interesting to talk about in the future. But I think we've talked a lot about the practicality, and I think that three tenant outlook on philosophy by Epictetus that you mentioned is really crucial, and I think it helped me understand Book 6 a lot better, and how all of these ideas connect in some way.
Right.
So I thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of switching gears, shifting just from the sort of the clouds and the universe. What were some things? Because I'm also interested in this text as the sort of the metaphysical, the universe, but also the practical. What did you find particularly intriguing?
Well, I think it deals with what we were talking about before, about that 3-block sort of thing. But I think it was number 6, chapter 6, that to me was really awesome, right? It says, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. And if we're talking about practical, all I can think of is that wonderful example in Marcus Aurelius' own life, where he had that one general who tried to take over the throne when he was sick. And if you recall that.
I do remember in his lifetime that there was I think so, sort of an interloper and a general, I think, who declared he was emperor, and he had to sort of march east and fix all that.
Yeah, but it's the way he handled that what was very fascinating. And if we take that little writing where he said, the best revenge you can do is not to be like your enemy, we can only assume, if we're in the position, or if I was, or I don't know, anybody really, we would be more inclined to say, okay, we could just kill this guy because he tried to take the throne. He deserves to be punished. But Marcus Aurelius, instead, he makes it a point to forgive him.
Yeah.
And use that as an example for his soldiers and for his people, as a way to say, hey, look, we're supposed to love our brothers no matter what they do. And it goes back to the whole idea, too, of the whole, that it's all to love genuinely, I think, as we said before, to accept these people as having reason as well, and being a part of that whole as well, and not trying to act as a tumor on this world, and to say, oh, well, he betrayed me too much, so I'm going to kill him. It's just, okay, he did this, but I still love him, and I'm willing to forgive him. And I think, to me, that is one of the more practical and incredible examples from his own life, and to see that little bit from chapter 6 maybe reminded me of that example and said, wow, he actually did follow that in some way to a T, where he said, like, I could be like that person and try to take over the throne, or like I could instill that sort of violence upon him that he tried to on me, but I'm going to be better than that, and I'm going to spare his life and spare any kind of penalty that I could have unleashed easily upon him.
Right, easily, yeah.
And yeah, I think that's one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed this book because I felt like he gave really good, just sort of almost leadership advice. If there's a way that, if I don't want to say if Marcus Aurelius were a motivational speaker, but if Marcus Aurelius had a really good TED Talk, I feel like it would be almost a way of combining sort of leadership with emotional intelligence and
he had to.
Yeah.
He was his audience. He was the motivational speaker for himself. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what these books are in some ways. I think we've talked about before how these are sort of pep talks to himself to some degree, or that's one of the means of which I think he gets at presenting these ideas, is by saying, okay, I'm going to tell myself, when you get up from bed, you have to be purposeful and make your life purposeful. And you say, well, look, I could get angry at this person, or I could accept it and forgive him. And I think there is that practicality that he looks for in himself. Like you said, he's trying to motivate himself. He's human, as you've mentioned before. We can only assume he's telling himself these things because he's struggling too. And sometimes the best motivational speaker is you.
Yeah, and I think
that you are the only best audience sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were just a few things that I thought were that really just stood out to me. Just his sense of resilience, and he just says that there's pretty much nothing that is out of sort of the grasp of human reach, and he just says that if you can physically do it, then he asks, then why don't you do it? And I really liked in chapter 50, he just said, if there's someone who is, basically barring the way or a path for you to do something, he just says, refuse to yield to distress, and so use the setback to display another virtue. And I really like that, because it's not, he doesn't say give up. He just says, hey, how can I make this an opportunity for success? And it's almost, he's kind of teasing out a positive psychology. And I think that in my favorite chapter probably of this entire book, when he says in 48, when he says when you're down and upset, he just urges you to think about the good qualities of people around you. Quote, the energy of one, for instance, the modesty of another, the generosity of a third, and some other quality in another, for there's nothing more heartening than the images of virtues shining forth in the characters of those around us.
That's how he starts this whole meditations, is by listing out all the traits. And we can only imagine that maybe he was going through a hard time and he said, well, I need to list out all of these good qualities that I've learned from the people. Not that I've used, because maybe I'm sure he's humble enough to say like he hasn't done all the things that these people have taught him, but at least like these people have taught me what it is to lead a good life, or what it is to maybe acknowledge the physical and the logical and the ethical in some degree better than I could, or what I'm trying to do now. So yeah, that was one of my favorites too. And I've even found myself trying it just for like 5 minutes, and I just remember like feeling good, feeling a little more happier, a little less morose from doing it. It's like, wow, this actually really is nice, because you, actively think about how other people affect your life and what you learn from other people. Because sometimes we don't do that, and we just accept people in our lives, say, oh yeah, he's a good person. How is he a good person? What have you learned from him? And actively seeking people out, or seeking your friends, the people you know, as teachers, is in some way, I don't know, instructive and uplifting to a degree. Because maybe you were acknowledging the whole, or you're acknowledging the parts of life that maybe you didn't really notice before.
Yeah, and I think that what really just strikes me as impressive is how much he tries to divorce as much as his ego as he can to this, and he just says, hey, I might be emperor, but I'm just trying to do my duty. And he's not constantly trying to aggrandize himself. In fact, if anything else, he's really trying to sort of honor the whole. And in doing so, he really extols the people that he cares about, be it advisors, fellow generals, his predecessor,
Yeah, and that goes back to chapter 12. I'm surprised we haven't talked about chapter 12 yet, where he compares, or he uses the analogy of a mother and a stepmother, where he says, like, look, you'll love the stepmother, but like the mother you'll always come back to. And he says about court life, he says, the court life is sort of like a stepmother, but like you should really be coming back to philosophy all the time. That is your bread and butter. That is your source. That is your nourishment. That is your way to understand the logical, the physical, the ethical, and to get at how all of these three things combine and work off of each other and create a good life. And the only way you can even come to close to understanding how those three work is philosophy. Right. And the court life isn't, like being an emperor isn't really going to get you that. But knowing philosophy can help inform the court life, but the court life shouldn't be the main priority.
Right.
Yeah,
and I think that can definitely apply for us today.
Oh, yeah. We're not all in court, but we all have life in general.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's kind of easy. I mean, I don't know, you just think about with social media and stuff like that. It's easy to get sort of glamored, by these sort of like things and these like sort of lifestyle that you think that you should really be buying into. But it's really just simple things like philosophy and friends and family that, are probably arguably the most readily available solutions to a happy life, or a happier one.
Yeah. Or just philosophy in general, because I think friends and family and all those things can be subsumed into philosophy if we think of like, okay, like how do I treat other people? Like how do I treat people that I care about, aka friends, and how do I deal with people that don't treat me nicely, and how do they all work into the physical whole, and do they have some kind of logic, or like what kind of logic am I using on them, and finding out like philosophy is that way. I mean, I think as I said in the last podcast, it's sort of this medicine that we keep going back to in some way, where Marcus Aurelius keeps going back to, and I think he has to just constantly remind himself, saying like, philosophy is the way that I can become a better person and become a better king, or become, a better emperor.
Yeah, don't say king.
Well, yeah, because all I can think of is Plato's philosopher king, and how much, I think we were talking about off camera, how Marcus Aurelius sort of embodies that idea of a ruler who is informed and enlightened to some degree. I mean, I don't know much of how his rule went. I know he's considered, some like part of the good emperor clique, or whatever you want to call it.
Clique, yeah. I would say that there's a lot of like terrible things that happen, like plague, couple of war, like 2 wars that I can think of. The Tiber flooded in Rome. So there's a lot of disaster, but I think that this was a way for him, I think, to kind of handle himself and all of his subjects and all the sort of calamities in like a very fair and humane way.
Yeah, and we can learn from that how to deal with our own Tiber's floods and plagues, and in a positive way that respects the whole.
Yeah, so I guess we're just coming up on an hour, and I think with that we should just are there any sort of concluding thoughts or anything like that?
I think we touched on it really well, and I think I want to emphasize just the three-prong idea you brought up in the beginning. That was Epictetus's. What is philosophy for? It's about the physical, like understanding what the physical is. It's understanding what the ethical is, and it's understanding the logical. It's understanding how I live in the world, or what is the world. How do I engage in it, and how do I perceive it in some way, I suppose, or how do I perceive it and perceive others and stuff, and like those three things in a sense are like very practical and like questions we have to ask ourselves. And Marcus Aurelius, at least in this book 6, encapsulates them in some way and forms this relationship between these three things, and we see how each of them inform the other and combine and collide and coincide in ways that create a practical life, or a way to engage in a practical and positive life.
And it's just how you understand the world can just inform your own worldview, and how to be a good person within that world, aka the whole. So I think with that, I think that we should say farewell and be kind and be generous to the whole, and be generous with each other. So thank you everyone for listening. And if you like what you're hearing, just download the Noetic app in the App Store, or is it Google Play for Droid?
Play,
yeah. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye everyone.